The first call went to voicemail. That wasn't unusual by itself. Anthony Hopkins didn't always answer immediately. He kept odd hours. He worked quietly. He valued uninterrupted time. So his agent left a message. "Call me when you get this." The second call came the next day. Straight to voicemail again. Then a third. By the end of the week, it was noticeable. By the end of the second week, it was concerning. And by the end of the month, it was unprecedented. Anthony Hopkins was not returning calls. Not from his agent. Not from studios. Not from directors he had worked with for decades. At first, people assumed something mundane. He was traveling. He was working. He was taking time off. But then the offers kept coming, and none were acknowledged. A prestige drama. A limited series pitched around him. A director who had won awards with him before. Silence. No polite declini. No scheduling conflict. No explanation. Just absence. The agent drove to his house. Hopkins answered the door. He looked well. Calm. Unbothered. "You didn't get my messages?" the agent asked, half relieved, half exasperated. "I did," Hopkins said. "And I chose not to answer." The agent laughed nervously. "All of them?" "Yes." The agent stepped inside, lowering his voice. "Tony, people are worried." Hopkins berättade. "About what?" he asked. "You've gone quiet," the agent said. "Completely quiet." Hopkins handed him a cup. "I know." The agent hesitated. "Is everything all right?" Hopkins sat across from him. "Everything is exactly as it should be." That was not reassuring. "You can't just disappear," the agent said carefully. "Not like this." Hopkins smiled faintly. "I haven't disappeared. I've stopped responding. That's the same thing in this business." Hopkins shook his head. "No. One is avoidance. The other is choice." The agent leaned forward. "What's going on?" Hopkins didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, it was quiet. "I needed to hear what would happen if I didn't." The agent frowned. "Hear what?" "The silence," Hopkins said. The agent stared at him. "Tony, this is your career." Hopkins nodded. "That's why I'm listening." Word spread quickly. Not publicly, but internally. "Have you heard from him?" "No." "Nothing at all?" "Not a word." Studios began to hesitate before mentioning his name in meetings. Producers wondered if he was ill. Directors speculated privately, worried they'd done something wrong. One executive finally asked his agent directly, "Is he done?" The agent didn't know how to answer. Because Hopkins hadn't said he was retiring. He hadn't announced a break. He hadn't explained anything. He had simply gone quiet. And the industry doesn't know how to talk to silence. Months earlier, before the call stopped, Hopkins had been everywhere. Awards conversations. Long lunches. Scripts arriving daily. Meetings framed as conversations that were really negotiations. He had felt it building again. The momentum. The familiar pressure to remain visible. To stay relevant. To keep answering, keep engaging, keep reassuring everyone that he was still available. Available to play the role. Available to anchor the project. Available to lend weight to the story. He'd done that dance for decades. And one morning, without drama, without frustration, he decided not to. The decision wasn't impulsive. It came after a dinner he barely remembered. A long table. Too many voices. People talking about him while sitting next to him. Referencing his work as if it were a fixed object rather than something still alive. "You're perfect for this," someone had said. "You don't even need to stretch," another joked. Hopkins smiled politely. Inside something tightened. Not anger. Recognition. He went home that night and didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, from clarity. He realized that if he kept answering every call, he would never hear himself think again. So when the phone rang the next morning, he let it ring. Then again the next day. And the day after that. The quiet was startling at first. Then it became revealing. He noticed how often his phone had filled space for him, interrupting thought, redirecting attention, pulling him back into a version of himself other people needed. Without the calls, the days opened up. He read. He walked. He played music. He thought about nothing and everything. The industry, meanwhile, reacted predictably. Concern turned into speculation. Speculation into narrative. He's tired. He's difficult now. He's lost interest. He thinks he's above it. None of that was true. Hopkins wasn't rejecting work. He was rejecting noise. 6 months in, a director he respected deeply ignored protocol and showed up unannounced. Hopkins let him in. "You scared people," the director said bluntly. Hopkins smiled. "That wasn't my intention. But you knew it would happen." "Yes." The director exhaled. "Why?" Hopkins looked out the window for a moment. "Because," he said. "Every time I answered, the conversation was already decided." "Decided how?" "What I should be," Hopkins replied. "What I should represent. What I should repeat." The director frowned. "You can still choose." Hopkins nodded. "Not if I never leave the room." The director sat back. "So this is what? A test?" Hopkins shook his head. "It's a reset." The director studied him. "For how long?" Hopkins answered honestly. "As long as it takes." "But you're losing opportunities." Hopkins smiled faintly. "I'm losing expectations." That distinction mattered. As the year went on, something strange happened. The calls slowed. Not because people stopped wanting him, but because they stopped assuming he was accessible. Meetings happened without his name attached. Projects moved on. The machine adapted. And in that adaptation, Hopkins felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not relief from work. Relief from obligation. He wasn't proving anything anymore. Not responding had freed him from the subtle performance of availability, the idea that he owed an answer simply because someone asked. Late one night, his agent called again. Hopkins let it ring. Then after a moment he answered. "I need to know," the agent said, voice tight. "Is this permanent?" Hopkins considered the question. "No," he said. "But it is necessary." "For what?" the agent asked. Hopkins paused. "To remember," he said. "What belongs to me." That was all he offered. And the industry would have to decide what to do with a year of unanswered calls, and a man who no longer rushed to fill the silence. But the real reason Anthony Hopkins stopped answering Hollywood wasn't about rest or rebellion. It was about something he had nearly lost. And the cost of reclaiming it would only become clear after the year ended, when he finally chose to speak again. That part of the story hadn't arrived yet. Not until the silence had done its work. When the year ended, nothing dramatic announced it. There was no press release. No carefully timed interview. No explanation offered to satisfy curiosity. Anthony Hopkins simply picked up the phone one morning and made a call. It wasn't to a studio. It wasn't to his agent. It was to himself. He sat quietly, tea cooling beside him, and asked a question he hadn't allowed himself to ask in decades. What do I actually want to do next if no one is waiting for an answer? The silence that followed felt different now. Not empty. Complete. Only then did he return the call. His agent answered on the first ring, breath catching when he heard Hopkins' voice. "Tony." "I'm here," Hopkins said. The relief on the other end was immediate. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than I've been in years," Hopkins replied. The agent laughed softly. "You have no idea what this year has been like." Hopkins smiled. "I think I do." They spoke briefly. No apologies. No explanations. Hopkins didn't feel the need to justify the silence. He didn't know anyone a reason for choosing quiet over noise. "Are you ready to work again?" the agent asked carefully. Hopkins considered the word ready. "I'm ready to listen," he said. "If there's something worth hearing." The distinction was subtle but absolute. When the news spread that Hopkins was reachable again, the industry reacted cautiously. Some offers returned immediately. Unchanged, rehearsed, expecting the old dynamic. Hopkins declined those without hesitation. He recognized the tone instantly. Others approached differently. Slower. Quieter. Less certain. One script arrived without a cover letter. No premises. No framing. Just the story. Hopkins read it twice. Then he called the director himself. Not to negotiate. To ask a question. "Why does this need me?" he asked. The director didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't polished. Because I don't know how to make it without you, he said. Hopkins listened carefully. That's not enough, Hopkins replied. But it's a start. They talked for hours. That was the project he chose. Not because it was big. Not because it was prestigious. Because it was uncertain. When Hopkins returned to set months later, people noticed the difference immediately. He wasn't recharged in the usual sense. He was untethered. There was no urgency to prove relevance. No pressure to reaffirm status. No desire to reassure anyone that he was still the Anthony Hopkins. He didn't bring silence with him as a tactic. He brought it as a filter. When conversations drifted toward expectation, he redirected them toward intention. When asked to commit too early, he asked to wait. When pushed to define outcomes, he refused. It will tell us what it is, he said simply. If we let it. Not everyone could work that way. Some people left the project early. Others leaned in. The set grew quieter. More focused. Decisions took longer but held longer too. Hopkins wasn't absent anymore. He was deliberate. The year of silence had changed how people spoke to him, and how he listened in return. But the most profound change was internal. By refusing to answer for 12 months, Hopkins had broken a pattern he hadn't known how to escape. The reflex to respond, to accommodate, to remain visible. Visibility, he'd learned, was not the same as presence. And presence didn't require constant confirmation. Late one evening, a younger actor approached him hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" the actor said. Hopkins nodded. "How did you know it was time to step back?" Hopkins considered the question carefully. "When the phone stopped ringing," he said, "I noticed how much of my thinking came back." The actor frowned. "But what if the calls don't come back?" Hopkins smiled gently. "Then you learn what you're willing to do without them." That was the lesson the year had taught him. Not how to disappear, but how to return on his own terms. The silence had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. It had revealed which conversations mattered, which collaborations were honest, and which expectations were simply inherited noise. Hollywood had adjusted. It always did. But Hopkins hadn't adjusted back. He no longer answered quickly. He no longer committed early. He no longer mistook interest for alignment. And because of that, the work that followed carried a different weight. It wasn't louder. It was truer. Years later, when someone finally asked him directly about the year he stopped answering calls, Hopkins responded with characteristic simplicity. "I wasn't punishing anyone," he said. "I was listening." "Listening to what?" the interviewer pressed. "My life," Hopkins replied. There was no grand takeaway offered. No instruction given. Just a quiet truth. Sometimes the most important answer isn't spoken. Sometimes it's withheld long enough for you to hear what remains when everything else goes quiet. Anthony Hopkins had ignored Hollywood for a year. Not to make a point, but to remember who he was when no one needed anything from him. And when he returned, he didn't bring the noise back with him. He brought choice. That was the end of the silence. And the beginning of something far more durable.